Fantastic questions so far, everybody. What I'm going to suggest that we try doing is I've grouped the questions that you've given us in terms of into about 5 topics, 6, something like that. I'm going to go through each of those topics, and at the end during the discussion of each of those topics, if there's an additional question that you have that's on the same topic, then come down to the microphones at that time, and we'll try to pull you into the discussion and add on additional questions to the same topic to the extent we have time. We'll also try to have time to leave time towards the end for any additional questions on new topics that weren't covered on any of your cards so far. But that'll help focus the discussion a little bit, okay? And I'll just tell you the sorts of topics that people have put forward. We're going to start by talking about what several people mentioned as the elephant in the room, which is the issue of population growth. We're then going to move on to something that Jill just mentioned, the issue of personal responsibility. Then, sorry, this will take me a moment. Then we're going to turn to the issue of prioritizing for conservation, the challenge of imperfect evidence, development and global warming, the poor and conservation, and we'll end up on the topic of hope.
And all that by dinner time.
And all that by dinner time. So let's start with several of you mentioned the fact that none of the speakers today talked about the issue of population growth. Some of you brought this home. Someone specifically asked about individual decision making about having children. Someone else asked, how do we prevent population growth from causing irreversible environmental damage? Someone else asked, aren't we trying to tackle the symptoms of environmental degradation when the real cause is population growth? Someone specifically asked Bill Adams, when the world was expected to land at 9 to 12 billion people, and what the world would be like at 9 to 12 billion people. So let's start off with that very specific question. Bill Adams, when are we going to end up with 9 to 12 billion people, and what will the world look like then? And maybe, Jill, you might have some thoughts on that second question too.
Population predictions vary. I think 2020 is the sort of date people talk about, and 9 to 12 billion is one of several scenarios that are there. And there's an awful lot of things that might disrupt that. What's the world going to look like? Well, I think it depends an awful lot on where those people are and how they're subsisting. And really, it's a question as to whether I think we can devise a model for living which is not the model of Northwest Europe and North America. Because I think if we try to deliver the styles of living that we have for 12 billion people, then I just don't think it can be achieved. And that's simply the throughput of energy, the throughput of materials is too great. And I think about, in the 1970s, when I first discovered this sort of environmental debate and when environmentalism was taking off, population growth was the big issue. And in a sense, it is still there, but the real problem I think people talk about now is that what that drives is consumption growth. That the real problems are the amount of resources, energy, material throughput, the stuff that we consume and the stuff that we chuck out. And that the real choices are about how we organize those systems. So crudely, I think the impact that I and my children have and will have in the world is far greater than that of, let's say, the African farmers that I used to work with in Nigeria, simply because we have access to wealth and resources and we enjoy using them. So I think there's a balance between the patterns of consumption and the actual number of people.
Let me ask you, if the world does stabilize at 9 to 12 billion people, and if the majority of those people, the vast majority of those people, succeed in breaking out of poverty, as they have been doing in East and parts of South Asia, not yet in Africa, what sort of quality of life do you see for those 9 to 12 billion people? Do you see, assuming that they all break out of poverty, do you see our descendants living anything like the quality of life we currently enjoy? What do you imagine?
I don't think that they will enjoy the pattern of life that we have. I don't think that they will all be jumping on aeroplanes and going to Coral Islands for holidays or dreaming of doing those things. But I think quality of life isn't actually related to... I think the quality of life is poorly related to the things we consume. So, in a sense, I guess what I say is that there's no reason not to imagine people having a good quality of life. It'll just have to be organized very differently. And the notion that many of the patterns that we have become used to, I don't think are replicable for that number of people.
Did you mention time frame? You probably did, and I missed it.
I mean, we're talking about 2020. That seems to be within the frame. It's an interesting point about thinking about the future, is how far ahead we can plan. And 20 years or so seems to be about the range that people can get a grip on. In other words, if you have children now, or if you have children who might have grandchildren now, money, then that's the sort of time frame. So, I mean, people talk about 2020, that's the time when the big anthropogenic climate change is going to start kicking in. That's when the turn back will become very difficult. That's maybe when population will start to stabilize. But I mean, I'm not an expert at all in this kind of future planning. But it's a matter of talking about whether the glass is half full or half empty. One can be positive about the prospects of the future, or one can be very worried about them. It's certainly going to be a very different world.
It's funny, I actually usually talk about this, and I'm realizing I forgot to say that, but I think we're beyond the carrying capacity of our Earth, and I think we need to have fewer children. And when I polled the environmental community in Alaska looking for what they would say if they were to happen to give a talk in New York to a bunch of people interested on the future of the Earth, I talked to 20 people, and every single one of them said that they thought the solution was a smaller population. Or I shouldn't say the solution, but the first step is a smaller population.
The Millennium Development Goals are driving a lot of policy changes. And it's very striking that they duck that issue, and they duck that issue for political reasons, because there's political pressure to avoid it. So it's the elephant in the room we're not talking about, and we're not talking about it at a very high level. And I think that's a serious problem that we need to think about. There are some elements of optimism. The predictions were a lot more pessimistic decades ago. It's now realized that as societies become more affluent, they become more urbanized, they become better educated, then the birth rate drops very rapidly. And the high prediction rates that we had a long time ago, I think, are now considered much less likely. And to me, we want to be thinking about what actually works. And it seems that one measure that is extremely effective is educating girls. And the more that we educate girls, the greater the benefits. It has multiple benefits. That to me is globally one of the most important things we can do.
I see one person over here with a question on this topic.
Yes, and
You sound great.
Well, I was rather hoping, and I was not disappointed, that the man who could tell us about lemon juice was the one who would bring up the one positive, repeatable correlation between all the factors influencing population control and female literacy. From what I've read, is this correct, is the one constant correlation, more than aid, more than rising standards of living, clean water, anything. It's female literacy that corresponds to the drop in birth rates. So it does seem to me like if we want to save polar bears, we should be going and teaching little girls how to read. Another illustration of how everything's connected. Is there anything that you see that we can do in the current political climate to begin talking again about the desirability of at least slowing the population explosion. In the 70s, it was right in the middle of the table. And I remember that, and I didn't read this part, but I guarantee you that my children consume less and have a smaller carbon footprint than your average child in Botswana, and that's because my children weren't born, and that was a choice. What can we do?
Your card is here.
Yeah, that was
I'm
mine.
assuming that two people didn't write the same thing, and that segues into, and I put your card specifically as a segue into the next question, which is a question about what lay people can do and personal responsibility, and you've clearly, as an individual, decided that one of the things you can do is to not have kids. Many people might consider that a relatively drastic alternative. Obviously, the nation of China decided some time ago to legislate that people could only have one child. Jill, let me leave it with you just now, because you started talking about personal decision making and what lay people can do about the sorts of crises that we're discussing here.
Yeah, I don't have a smart answer. I mean, I do think it's an individual decision. I made a similar decision. I really can't think of what to say.
Okay. Not only about population growth, but about all of the environmental challenges and poverty alleviation challenges. Adam.
Yeah, I think there's I think the biggest difficulty is people feeling that these challenges are so great that there is nothing that they can do. And I took from Jill's talk very strongly the view that you do something, and you must never be disabled by the argument that this act that I'm doing is not going to solve the problem, therefore the act is not worth doing. And I'm a great believer both in the power of symbolic acts, but also in the fact that if you believe in something and you make a move, then that's part of a change process. And I think we're often locked into situations which we come to regret, but there are opportunities at every point to make choices. Every time you go to the supermarket or every time you don't go to the supermarket, there are choices that you make about the things that you buy, the things that you do with what you buy, and there's all sorts of things that you might decide not to use, whatever that is. You might decide not to fly as much, not to drive as much, not to consume as much, or not to consume certain kinds of products because you don't like them. And I get very frustrated when people say, "Oh, but if you're crazy to buy sort of shade-grown, organic, fair trade coffee, that's just a cop-out," because someone was telling me yesterday that there's all sort of knock-ons. I think those things are very good. I think consumption decisions are very important, and I think you should make those decisions, and if someone comes up with a better decision, move. I mean, just move. Jump in, as your phrase, Jill. I think that penguin just about had it right. You have to move. And help people to learn to live with the decisions they make. So I think in that sense, there are lots of choices that we make. Every time we flick a light switch, every time we accept to go somewhere, there's a consequence to that. There's a price to pay on the environment. There are consequences. And it's not easy to plot a perfect course. There is no clever solution. There are lots of small choices, but there are lots of us. And therefore, in a sense, you can see the whole world system shifting slightly but progressively. And that has to be the right thing to do.
And there's one line to add, and that's just there's not only consequences, but there's this ripple effect, and it's quite remarkable. I mean, a lot of people had children in the 70s because everybody else was having children, and it seemed like the right thing to do. And who are we to say that, we get our validity often from what other people are doing. So the more people who take these small actions, it gives us the courage to do either the same thing or move in some direction that where that example is being set.
Before I move to the next card, let me be controversial and say that one goes to talks like this and people talk about personal responsibility and individual decision making. And then I look at the audience and see that we've got a great turnout today of 310 people or something like that, out of a nation of 300 million people. And I'm not sure how many people come to lectures like this, but But even if every individual who comes to lectures like this changes their behavior, I'm not completely confident that that's going to make that much difference, though perhaps if they all go to movies like Al Gore's, it will. How important is individual decision-making, and how important is it to come up with corporate decision-making strategies, which, of course, is why we have governments? Bill?
I think you're exactly right, that it isn't the answer. There's a belief that we can solve these problems by these individual decisions, but we clearly can't. And so there's a paper in Science which said, what are we going to do to solve the climate change problem? What is the solution? And the answer was that there isn't the solution. We can solve it by adopting a whole range of different solutions. And if we put all of those in place, we could overcome this problem. And part of that is individuals behaving more responsibly. And I think also, ethically, if we're asking other sectors to make changes, then we have to show that we have a willingness to change ourselves. I think it's unacceptable to demand that societies are changing, that we impose changes on others when we're not prepared to change ourselves. So that, to me, seems to be a lot of the justification for individual responsibility.
I mean, I would add that Cambridge University happens to sit in a country which ratified the Kyoto Treaty on climate change. Those of us who live in the United States live in a country which has not yet ratified that treaty. It's obviously only one move in the right direction, but it may well be the single most significant move in that direction. And I would have thought that political activism on issues such as ratifying Kyoto and the successor to Kyoto is a pretty crucial way to move the world in the right direction. The U.S. produces 25% of all of the carbon dioxide produced by all the people on the planet, even though we have less than a quarter the population that you would expect for that amount. And as long as the U.S. stalls on this, then it gives other countries such as China, such as Australia, an excuse for them not to go ahead with this as well. There is, please. Question, please.
Actually, I want to thank the wonderful outcome of this wonderful dog and pony show on this very alarming subject for leading organically to a segue for me to ask a question that didn't fit in any of your categories, James. And my question has to do with instrumentality. Further towards the issue of your development, James, of the concept of personal responsibility to that of corporate, I'm wondering about the university as a whole and the degree to which the wonderful fact of these new chairs and these new professors and the gentlemen that occupy them being at Cambridge, to what extent that and whatever has come out of the initiative that was created about 15 years ago, the Cambridge Interdisciplinary Environment Program, for leveraging this issue across the university and for the university itself using the issue, using its position to leverage the issue within the UK, as well as utilizing the network of Cambridge graduates. For example, James, if everyone here relays this to 300 other people and it goes out that way, then it might be useful and we could model out how many more people we'd have to be talking to have an effect. But of course, if this show is taken on the road further afield, it might be able to have that outcome. And I'm thinking about Cambridge graduates who are in government, in corporations, and also in other universities. And then finally, the degree to which it might be possible for Cambridge to use its position as a leader in this issue, as a university and the city of Cambridge itself, to leverage the issue for other universities, for example, Harvard University here in the States. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think that's this is going to appear to be a planted question, especially since we know each other, but it's not, because it's a nice segue for me to mention that that one example of how each of us can move forward, both as individuals but also as institutions, has to do with offsetting our carbon production. And in fact, for this some of you will have noticed in the brochure that for this very event, this event is estimated to produce about 4.57 tons of carbon dioxide emissions as a result of the two bills flying over from the UK. Jill, I don't know where you came from. I'm where did you come from? Alaska. I'm the virtuous one here. I took the subway to get here. But that 4.57 tons of carbon emissions has been offset through an organization called Climate Care. And the principle of carbon offsets is that there are organizations and funds to which each of us as individuals and as corporate institutions can give money, which use that money to, usually it's to, either to plant trees in parts of the world where there are reforestation projects, or to develop technologies such as wind generation of energy, of electricity, that will reduce CO2 emissions in the future. Although these things are in their infancy, they are moving forward. And I think the fact that this event has already had all of its CO2 offset, so that none of us have to feel as guilty. I'm not saying we shouldn't feel a little guilty, but as guilty for being here, perhaps leads the way. And I think is an indication that we can expect to see that kind of leadership from Cambridge as an institution. And I think that the two guys to my left will be responsible for reporting back to us in 5 or 10 years. We'd love to see Cambridge become a carbon neutral institution.
I can give you some news on that, or some information on that from the university's end. It's interesting. Among other things, I chair the university's Committee on Environmental Management, and I've done quite a lot of teaching on corporate courses, and one of the things they always ask is, what does the university do? And universities are very complex places to understand, but we've basically now done a major project with something called the Carbon Trust, which is aiming to measure the carbon CO2 signature of the whole university's estate. And that's we've now got sort of carbon efficiency programs in there. And I'm trying to get the university to adopt a carbon target, which is tricky in an institution which is growing, because that means you have to get more and more efficient. So that's interesting. The second thing which we did was to conduct a pilot survey of academic travel, and this has caused a lot of ripples across the university because particularly flying to America is seen as it's essential to maintaining the research base. And we've got some estimates, and the estimates suggest that academic travel is responsible for about a quarter of the total carbon output of the entire building stock. And I want to redo that next year if they'll let me, and then try to set a target for that, so you can deliver the same research and teaching excellence at a static carbon level, at least static, and then maybe reduce it. So that's interesting. That's very unpopular. But
I certainly know that when I was at Cambridge, and it wasn't all that long ago, there was very little CO2 being emitted as a result of central heating. So
Cambridge City Council has just passed a regulation that says that all new developments of more than 10 houses or more than 1,000 square meters have to generate 20% of their energy use from on-site renewable sources. And the university is just sort of, buildings committee is just discussing that, because that's interesting. The new Physics of Medicine building was just about to be commissioned, and it's now got 3 wind turbines on top. So it's an interesting time to be trying to sort of talk about these things. And the number of times people sort of say, well, put your own house in order and then preach, to me is quite right and proper, but it happens all the time.
Thanks. Bill? Other Bill?
Oops.
Sutherland, shoot.
Yeah, I'm the new boy here, so and I've said that I think I'm too close to retirement to try to understand how Cambridge works. So I don't think I can comment on that. But I think there's the name. I'm struck by the fact that the name of Cambridge and the reputation and the fact that it's a lovely place to be and there are lots of people linked to it means that there are lots of opportunities to move the agenda forward. And particularly, people like finance ministers. Why can't we pull in finance ministers from around the country and put them up in a college and give them a good time and convince them about the importance of environmental issues? They are the key people, and I think it's those sorts of things that's how we're really going to make a difference to this planet, if we can influence people like that and find ways of doing so. And I think the links with Cambridge just open so many doors and open so many opportunities that I think we need to take advantage of that.
We have several people waiting, and I imagine this is on these issues of personal responsibility and climate change and carbon. Please.
Well, it is related at least to climate change and somebody's personal responsibility. President Bush took the position from the moment he took office that he did not want to make a move in the direction of some official set of actions related to possible climate change because he felt the science had not gotten far enough. And as far as I understand it, the science he was referring to was convincing evidence that the releases of various kinds of greenhouse gases really were having an influence. But there's another kind of evidence-based research which one could imagine that a prudent administration would have supported at the same time. And I want to see if members of the panel, especially Bill too, would agree with this. And that is to say, supposing it's true that we really need to do something about climate change, how about having research on a little project to see what this does, a little project to see what that does, all with the support of the government? Would that have been, if you like, a more clearly honest approach to this subject, and perhaps still in order right now?
Absolutely. And to some extent that is happening, but the more evidence we have and the more evidence of the effectiveness of interventions, the faster we can move on this. I think also there's a problem with this issue of uncertainty, and I think that's the way in which we teach science at school, that lots of people are turned off science because, well, it's a bit sort of boring and it's just a lot of facts. You know, learning science is learning facts, and it's not half as much fun as a lot of these other subjects. What science really is it's not an accumulation of facts. It's a way of doing things, and it's a way of questioning the assumptions and understanding the process and understanding uncertainty. And I think that's what we need to do. And I think there's a bit of a belief that scientists have to say what the answer is, and that means that if you're scientists, you disagree with each other. We love disagreeing with each other. And you've got to accept that's how it is, that it's false for us to say this is the truth. There has to be a range of versions of the truth, and you must accept that. And you must accept that's the way in which science operates. And we need to change our scientific education so that it's all about learning how to approach things, what is good evidence and what is poor evidence, and that I think would make a lot of difference to the way in which we would understand a lot of global problems.
I'm going to pick up on this question of imperfect evidence because it's something that a number of people asked, but I see that there are two other people waiting with questions. So if they're on these specific issues, before we move on, please.
I think so. Holistic is sort of where everything kind of goes, but there are a couple of things. One is in terms of the changes in consumption patterns, that the transition to consumption of digital resources that move us into a situation in which scarcity or wealth is not constrained by the laws of conservation of mass and energy. And that makes a profound radical opportunity in a sort of knowledge-based universe. And I think there's the context of the global transition to a knowledge-based universe has profound opportunities. So I think whether it's distributing your books, not 3,000 to 20 countries, but 10,000 downloads a day or whatever by PDF or HTML. But I just want to mention the other elephant in the room, the bigger elephant in the room. When we're talking about the future of life on Earth, if we're not talking about military policy of the United States and its domination by energy corporations, then future of life on Earth, all the rest is just, parlor games. And I think we need to address that so that imperative of energy is not just consuming the resources, but is curbing. Fortunately, they're headed for disaster in both Iraq and Afghanistan.
Thank you for that.
But I think we have to address that.
I expect you have much of this audience behind you on those comments. Another question or comment over here.
Yes, two brief questions on responsibility, personal and corporate. The first one is, this is for Bill Adams. What was the net impact to the livelihoods of the individuals after the Ugandan Wildlife Park conservation program? That is, how were they affected as individuals? The second question on corporate responsibility. Have there been attempts to quantify the economic value of biodiversity? And specifically, what will the conservation movement do to make sure that that economic value does not over time get transferred away from Africans? That is, the ownership of the economic value does not get transferred away from Africans and South Americans who, presumably at least to date, own the biodiversity. Thank you.
Good. It's a good question to which I don't have a properly researched answer. I think the impact of that. It's quite hard to assess the impact of something like a national park displacement program if you don't have the data before and after. And in this instance, no one measured that information beforehand. What the situation locally is, if you talk to the people who were living on the land that's now the park and are now living outside it, what you discover is in a sense that the average level of land hunger and associated poverty is so great across the community that those who were evicted are not obviously worse off than everyone else, but everybody's in a very difficult situation. Land is very short. And that the measures that were put in place in the area around the park, particularly by the non-governmental organisation CARE, have been very creative in terms of putting in water supplies, training people and providing them materials for sort of a more sustainable agricultural systems and mother and child health programs and support, all those sorts of things. They have been very successful. So if you talk to people and you say, well, have you benefited from these programs? They say, yes, that's very good and they're very useful. If you say, are they a compensation for what you lost? They say, of course not. And if you say, are you worse off than your neighbour who didn't have land in the park? They say, well, everybody's poor, which is true. So essentially you have this sort of huge well of poverty and need into which these programs sort of drop, and they do good, but they don't solve the problem. And I think that's not a very good answer, but that's basically my understanding of the situation.
Challenging. I'd like to pick up on this question of imperfect evidence, because it's something that that a number of different people addressed in their questions. And I'd like to start just by replying really as a layman, because I work in practical wildlife conservation in Africa and not directly in the issues of global warming and carbon. But certainly my understanding is that the difficulty of interpreting the evidence for both an increase in CO2 around the world, for the fact that increase has been produced by human activity, and for the fact that increase in CO2 is causing and will cause an increase in the temperature of the globe, that evidence is absolutely agreed, that there is virtually no scientist in the world who disputes the evidence for those three things, and that the popular perception that the evidence for those three facts is poor results, in fact, from a campaign by, and this gets back to the comments here, a campaign, in fact, by the energy industry to spread propaganda, much like the campaign by the tobacco industry, which delayed a popular understanding that cigarettes cause cancer for about 10 or 20 years. If, for those of you who saw the Al Gore movie, there's a figure there that there have been several hundred papers published in the last few years on global warming. Exactly one of those several hundred papers raises any doubts behind these basic facts whatsoever. If you compare that to popular articles, about half of the articles suggest the evidence is strong and about half of the articles suggest the evidence is weak. And so the issue is not poor evidence. The issue is that the popular perception is completely out of whack with the evidence that's out there. In fact, one of the questions asked specifically about this question, and let me just read this question. This person wrote, "The evidence base is sometimes questioned in medicine. Studies are withheld, et cetera, and there are issues of drug company funding, and this is claimed for global warming. Industry studies find against it, et cetera, the Heinz Foundation. And the question is, is this sort of thing a problem in conservation studies generally? And how do you deal with this when presenting to politicians? And I'd like to turn over those questions to the panelists here, whoever would like to comment.
Okay, I'll start. Starting with the climate change question, the Stern report came out a couple of weeks ago, and it's a very interesting report. It's by an economist. It's by the UK's economist. He's not the government chief economics advisor, so he's not an environmentalist. And he just looked at it from a straightforward economic perspective. And the argument he had was there's a lot of uncertainty as to what climate change is going to do. But there are real serious risks that there could be severe damage. And the line he said is that when you've other risks, you prepare yourself for those. That's why we insure our houses. We insure our houses because we think that there might be something horrible happening. It doesn't mean that something horrible will happen, but it is a very good investment. And that report, I think, is going to be extremely influential in changing the argument. Tony Blair said that it's the most important document that has come across his desk in his entire time as Prime Minister. I find that slightly over the top, but anyway, but still, I'm pleased that he's saying things like that are over the top. So you don't have to have absolute certainty. You don't have to have absolute certainty. We can have a range of possible outcomes, but you can still act upon that.
Bill? Adams?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the argument that one needs certainty and the expectation that science will deliver it is unhelpful in policy. Policymakers look to scientists very often to tell them what will happen, and as Bill was saying, science is a way of at any moment, scientists will tell you what they think is the situation, but new evidence, new data, new models will evolve that. So I think policymaking has to work accept that they're never going to have complete proof, particularly about the future. I think a lot of things with problems with biodiversity conservation, a lot of the difficulties are a set of non-scientific but rather sort of folk understandings within the policy community about what the resilience of natural systems. And the assumption is that all natural systems function a bit like the classic temperate meadow, which we all learned about at school in school ecology. And you leave a meadow and it grows back into a wood, and you chop down the wood and it's a meadow, and basically nature keeps bouncing back. And the trouble is that actually a lot of ecosystems weren't like that at all. Many of them don't have a sort of an equilibrium state from which they can be moved. They shift from state to state. So if all the ecologists that wrote the textbooks had lived in Niger, and they lived with arid zone systems in situations of fluctuating rainfall, the ecology we have would look very different. And the trouble is, globally, I don't know whether Bill would agree with this, I'm not, of course, an ecologist, and therefore speaking with the confidence of complete ignorance. But I think that, therefore, a lot of assumptions which are coded and unrecognized inside all of us are not good assumptions. And when you get something like the anthropogenic signature on climate change, it's not simply a matter of a big sort of rubber ball that you squeeze a bit and maybe it'll be a bit tricky, but it may be a ball that you actually roll right off the table. And that's when it gets very difficult to make these predictions, but it's why these things are very significant.
Two people have been patiently waiting over here. Bill Sutherland, please.
Shall I answer the second question?
Sure.
The second question was, are there biases? And undoubtedly there will be. There will be all sorts of distortions. There'll be a tendency towards favouring successes. There may well be people having commercial interests in documenting evidence. But to me, if we start making all this information available, and particularly when we put it all on an open access website, then everybody can see it and become much more transparent. And I think it'll be much more obvious where there are those biases. So we're not going to have a wonderful, perfect, unbiased data set, but at least we're going to be able to see what we have and we're going to be able to discuss it. So that is much better than the system we have at the moment, where it's all passed by word of mouth. And the more open and explicit we make it, I think it's going to expose those sorts of biases.
Before I go over here, there was another card was asking whether it makes a difference if understanding in conservation is more similar to understanding in economics rather than it is to understanding in medicine. and whether that would make a difference to how you would go about the process that you're working on.
I think that's probably true. The great thing about medicine is you have lots of cases. You know, if you do a randomized controlled experiment, sometimes you might do it on thousands of people, and you may well, if it's a common cold or something, you'll get your response within days. If you're running a conservation project, the sort of things that James is involved in, there will be one conservation project in an area that will last for decades, and it's very difficult to know whether or not it's working, and the response will be quite slow. To me, one of the ways forward is to break these big projects down into interventions, and we want to see whether or not those particular interventions work. So whether or not you're treating an invasive plant, does it die or not? You've got an education program. Does that result in less snaring of wildlife? When you break it down to interventions, I think it becomes much easier to have multiply replicated circumstances.
Please.
Hello. My question touches on personal responsibility and popular perception. The number that was mentioned as a stable number for the world's population of 9 to 12 billion people, it struck me that number is quite small, so we're going to reach it very soon. We're going to have an immediate problem, aren't we? Because, of course, if the population of the world jumps up to 12 billion, like you said about environmental systems, they go from state to state, there's going to be hundreds of millions of people dying before the population jumps back up again. And it strikes me that don't we have responsibility to educate school children in the UK? Is there any political will to make this part of the compulsory education of school children?
Well, I mean, it's a good point. There is a lot of interest in how you teach sustainability in its broadest senses, and whether or not there are issues relating to sustainability which ought to cross-cut the university curriculum and indeed the school curriculum, whether there is learning that ought to be happening outside, Latin and French and science. And I think recognition that there's an outfit in Cambridge called the Cambridge Programme for Industry, which does a lot of work with executives teaching sustainability, basically encouraging people to understand how to apply the challenges of sustainability to the business environment. And they've done something quite clever, producing a CD-ROM, which provides a sort of micro course for executives, and with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, I think that's its correct title. They've encouraged a number of big corporations have taken this up and developed this through their organisation. They've now done one for schools, and in fact somebody's seconded from the university into the Department for Education in Britain to develop sustainability, sort of cross-curricular sustainability education in schools. And the British school system it seems to be in perpetual turmoil, and whether this is simply one other initiative that will get lost, I don't know. But it's a nice idea, it's an important idea. And it reflects, I think, some of the things that Jill was saying about the importance of the perception of the world that you have. Remember the FedEx sign, which I will not now ever be able to forget, and the arrow. That in a sense, these issues about sustainability are about seeing the world as it is, or seeing the world in a new way. And actually, it doesn't necessarily take... You don't give people solutions. You say, do you realize that the world is like this? And do you realize that you have a responsibility for thinking about it? And you can do that very successfully with children. Indeed, they do it right back at you. And you can do it with business executives. They're a bit slower, but they get there eventually. And it can be quite a quick process. And you're not saying, this is the problem, this is the possible solution. You're saying, this is the problem, you're the possible solution, go away and think about it, please. And it's quite successful.
Another question?
Yes, it's another question on public and private choices and responsibilities. Of course, the question of public and private choices, that's the field of social sciences. And I do miss a social scientist, perhaps especially an economist on the panel. And from a social science perspective, of course, what we're talking about is very much a question of externalities. And there, of course, we can all think about that. As far as I remember, the first economist to talk about externalities that the market price doesn't capture the social cost of a product was the Cambridge economist Pigou in the early 20th century. And there, economists, the things we're talking about today, they would talk about them very much in these terms of externalities and correct pricing of these things. and it's a question of taxing transatlantic airline travel and quota trade quota trade on CO2 emissions. And I'm wondering about your views as natural scientists on these policies, especially concerning quota trade in emissions.
I will add to that question that perhaps the same person or a different person asked on a card specifically what the panelists thought about efforts to control consumption such as carbon trading schemes. I think it relates. Anyone have anything that they would like to say?
I mean, the market is a fantastically powerful institution as a way of linking people together, linking people's choices together. It is unparalleled, and there is no doubt that there's a lot of circumstances where if you can create a market which relates directly to the state or quality of the environment, then you can start to get that state and quality recognized in a way it's not previously been done, and carbon is the classic example of this. And the game is out as to how successful it will be, but there's no doubt that there's been a tremendous advances. There's also, of course, an argument that says that the values of nature are not easily summed up in those terms. There are lots of things which are important about the world which cannot be bought and sold, and that therefore we shouldn't jump in wholeheartedly or completely into the world and say, well, the challenge is to create markets in every aspect of the environment, and then basically everything will be all right. But it's undoubtedly a very exciting way of thinking about a number of issues. And very often you can see that environmental destruction happens because the aspects of the environment are not properly priced. There's a price being paid, but it's not in a market. And so it's an evolving area, very exciting. Not, I think, necessarily a universally satisfactory solution, but a very exciting.
I'll just add that the CO2 issue particularly lends itself to markets because it's a single quantifiable index. But there are some substantial problems with the current CO2 market. Probably the chief problem with it is that when Kyoto was imposed, Europe, well, obviously the first problem was that the U.S. didn't ratify it together with Australia and China. But an additional problem, which is turning out to be almost as lethal, is that instead of permission to produce CO2 being auctioned off to people, the way, for example, bandwidth in mobile telephones is auctioned off to people. Instead, permission to produce CO2 was given out to existing polluters in European countries. So within each European country, the country was given a target for leveling off CO2. Each country took their 5 most polluting industries and gave away permission to pollute to those industries. That has turned out to be disastrous. It's resulted in, over the last 6 months, a crash in the market price of carbon because it's turned out that those industries actually don't need to pollute as much as they were polluting before. And moreover, none of the European countries are in fact reducing their carbon emissions. So the whole thing is on the verge of failure as a result of that key decision to give away carbon credits instead of auctioning them off the way it probably should have been done. Just my personal opinion. I don't know if you...
Yeah, absolutely. A beautiful description. And the logic of it is very sensible because there's 2 ways you can do it. You can have regulations and have thresholds. The problem with that is you tend to set the threshold for the small percentage of the most polluting industries. If you set up a market, then it's in everybody's interest to be more efficient. So even if you're extremely efficient and very unpolluting, if you can tidy yourself up a little bit more, you then save some more money. So that means that everybody wants to reduce their levels of pollutants. So the market is a very sensible way of doing it. It's just a pity that there have been so many problems with this in this occasion.
Well, tell you another problem with the market, which is the fact that you can only drive a market into more environmentally sustainable ways of delivery if you buy things. I was looking at the bottled water here, which is one of my pet hates.
Oh, I know.
And you can, if there were two sorts of, if there were two makes of bottled water, you could say, well, this one is made by the Coca-Cola company and it comes from Kathmandu. And this one is made by the Pepsi company and it comes from half a mile up the road. I'm going to buy this one because it's local and it's got less miles, etc., etc. But if in fact you say, I don't like bottled water, I'm not going to buy it, neither corporation has any incentive to source more locally or to use biodegradable plastics or indeed to do something else. And that's the difficulty, I think, for the environmental movement. Non-consumption does not drive market change, and I feel that's a real difficulty.
I'm going to take us back, because we only have a few more minutes, to this question of, and I apologize for leaving you standing there for a minute longer. I had promised a previous questioner that we'd get back to the question of people who are in poverty around the world in conservation. And a number of people ask questions related to this on cards. They ask questions about how do we make biodiversity valuable to poor people, etc. I think I'd like to take those questions and rather than read each of them, summarize them in the question, how do we do conservation not on the backs of the world's poorest people? And I'd like to throw that question out to the three of you.
Okay, good. I mean, I think there isn't a single solution to this, but I suspect there are things that we can do. And it depends to a large extent on handing over control and handing over rights. I think that where people can get a very direct interest in the benefits of conservation, then they will support it. And a lot of projects around the world, most national park projects around the world have neighbour programs. They have situations in place to take gate receipts, to get a rent from facility managers and feed that back into the local community. But in most cases, it's not enough to really make a difference. So if you go to an African national park, you find that the money is being made primarily by the concession managers. The people who make the money are the ones who set up the package tours, who run the tour companies, who supply the elite products that the tourists want. And the amount of money that actually comes through at the end of the pipeline to the local community it's a steady drip, but it's a drip. And I suspect that that's simply a matter of trying to reorganize that industry so that there is a greater local participation. But there are benefits to be created. I do worry about any conservation program locally which says the solution is to increase ecotourism, which means all of us get in aeroplanes and fly across the world. Well, there is something bizarre about that, but that is at the moment how the industry is structured. And even with that structure of industry, not enough comes out at the end of the pipe. But that's a matter of restructuring the industry, restructuring the incentives, and trying to give a greater stake to the poor. And in that sense, I mean, I don't know if you noticed the man who won the Nobel Peace Prize, who set up the Grameen Bank, Muhammad Yunus, an extraordinary achievement because his genius was to lend money to people who had no assets. And banks don't do that, but his does, and it's very profitable and hugely successful. And therefore, I think that sort of strategy is something that we have to sort of make work in conservation. We have to give trust and we have to give resources to people who don't have either.
We tend to portray a clear distinction between people and conservation. And then when you're talking about, well, most people, but particularly poorer people, you would obviously go for protecting the people rather than the conservation. But it's now becoming increasingly clear that that's not a sensible dichotomy. If you look at the tsunami in Southeast Asia and you look at where it hit most severely, it hit most severely in the places that had lost their mangrove forest. In the areas that were well protected by mangrove forest, there was far less destruction taking place. It's also clear that coral reefs are hugely important in absorbing wave energy and also protecting areas. We know that Katrina had a more powerful impact because of the degradation of the wetlands that had taken place. So very often, rather than conservation being detrimental, conservation is actually beneficial. The challenge we have is the one that Bill's described, is for the individual. It is still sensible for the individual to go and blow up that bit of coral reef in order to get the rubble to build a house, or dynamite fish that coral reef to get the fish to sell in the market, because it makes sense individually. The challenge we have is to make the benefits for the wider community, which might be to the entire country, such that individuals are going to behave in a way that will take that into account. And that, to me, is perhaps the biggest challenge to conservation. And Bill and I have spent some time talking about the ways that can be achieved, but I think that's what we need to find ways of doing.
Please.
I am surprised. I'm surprised that this distinguished panel has not dealt more with the optimism which we can derive from the advances in genomics and biochemical engineering. You've been telling us what's going to happen in the future. Let me tell you what's going to happen in the future. Genomics and biochemical engineering can produce species which have never existed before. They all are already producing animals with a different type of metabolism from anything that we've seen. You're worried about extinction of species. Believe me, in a very short time, this science is advancing so quickly that we will have more species throughout the world, species created which are adapted well to the environment. And instead of having to rely on millions of years of natural selection or upon intelligent design, whichever is responsible, we will be able to produce new species in a few years. You're worried about your polar bear. He's losing his ice. Let him come south. Let's put genes in which give him a different metabolism so that he can live further south. Let him eat different substances. I find that every problem which has been mentioned today can be solved by the adaptation of species, and that we can look forward with optimism to a future that is controlled not by politicians, but by enlightened sciences of both sexes.
Thank you. Thank you. Would the panel like to comment on that?
I come back with a comment, which is I think you're absolutely right. Genomics is enormously powerful technology. I think it's moving extremely fast. There's areas such as biofuels, for example, which are going to see genetically modified and newly created organisms, microorganisms, introduced extremely rapidly. The US government wants 30% of petroleum to be replaced by biofuels by 2020, and that's incredibly fast. I think, in a sense, you're right that we have not mentioned that. It scares me to death, and that's not because there are going to be sort of polar bears which have been sort of genetically adapted to be able to swim Herculean distances from one ice cube to the next, but actually because I think the capacity to predict the impacts of those kind of created and released organisms is well beyond the capacity of science. But then I may be wrong, but you're right that it's significant. This is a very significant period of advance, and I think watch this space, watch your scientists, watch your governments, because I think it'll be very, very important what decisions are taken. So thank you for that. I think it's a very useful comment.
I have a slightly different perspective, although I find the comment stimulating. I think since the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and around the world in 1989, one of the things that many of us have learned is that a capitalist market has an ability to produce a million different intricate systems that link with each other and result in an efficiency orders of magnitude greater than the efficiency that a human-engineered system can at the scale of complexities of whole economies. I fear that exactly the same thing is true in ecology, which is true in economics. That is, that we can do small things here and there, and in fact, genomics of this sort right now involve taking one gene from one organism and transposing it to another. And it's very useful if you want to, for example, make a strain of potatoes resistant to a single disease, blight. But it doesn't result in the intricate interaction between organisms that make the entire biosphere of the world work. Just as Soviet engineering of the Soviet economy did not result in anything like the economic intricacy and efficiency and power of a capitalist system. And so I actually would guess that while this will be a useful technology, carefully controlled and carefully used, it'll be a technology which we can use for small problems around the edges. It's not going to replace the incredible, intricate relatedness of natural systems that have evolved through natural selection over millions of years, just as capitalist economies evolve through hundreds of years. And there is no substitute for that intricacy if we're going to make the whole globe work. That's my perspective.
Bill showed the analysis of the number of people that were starving, and there's a worrying number of people that are in poverty and having severe food shortage. That would be far more alarming if there hadn't been the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution is a genetical revolution whereby they bred much more effective crops, and as a result of that, far more people being fed around the world than would have been possible otherwise. And undoubtedly, genetic technology can improve that and solve a lot of the problems and make farming much more efficient in the areas that farming takes place, so reducing the area that farming has to take place in, so allowing greater capacity for us to have wild places. So there are positive sides to it. And I think what we have to do is look at it case by case. And certainly in the UK, I think we're slightly irrational about gene technology. There have been studies showing that most people don't want their crop plants to have genes in them, and and there are also studies showing that most people don't want their food to have any chemicals in them. So there's a lot of misunderstanding as to what is going on. But I think there are also genuinely serious concerns. We know that invasive species have caused havoc throughout the world, and there are various possibilities for genetic technology that I confess I find deeply, deeply scary, to do with microbes, to do with viruses, and that needs very careful checking and very careful thinking to make sure we don't release something that actually turns out to have a very serious consequence.
I know that people are looking forward to the drinks. I'm certainly looking forward to them, not least because of the challenging questions that you guys have asked. But I'd like to end on a few cards that raised the question of optimism and pessimism. One speaker wrote, are the speakers optimistic or pessimistic on the probability of balancing poverty, human issues, and biodiversity conservation? Another person wrote, it all sounds very complex and difficult. Is there any hope for saving wilderness and wildlife? Is there any hope? We are surrounded by pessimistic predictions. A final comment from any of the panelists on that.
I'm an optimist. I see there are exciting things happening and very positive things happening and very negative things happening. And there are lots of things that are great. You know, if you look at ignoring the climate change problem, which is undoubtedly a very serious problem, you look at a lot of wonderful things that are happening in the US in terms of nature conservation, and that is fantastic. You look at the UK, there are lots of advances that are going on. So talks of having a great area of wilderness coming to the edge of Cambridge, if that happens, that would just be glorious. So there are lots of exciting possibilities. And I think the agenda keeps shifting, but the agenda seems to be shifting back towards taking poverty alleviation seriously, taking environmental concerns seriously. So I'm reasonably upbeat about it.
I alternate whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I think that the human signature on Earth is enormous and it's going to get greater, but I take great heart from the fact that the environmental movement in a broad sense is growing and growing extremely rapidly. I think it'll grow very rapidly in South Asia and East Asia, and I think it'll be driven by people's desire to create a livable environment. And I think the thing that I find most inspiring is the work on ecological restoration in countries like the UK, where we have intense human use over many thousands of years, very intense over many hundreds of years, and people starting to try and put species back to create space for ecosystems to recreate themselves, space for nature to be natural. Now, it's not wilderness in the Alaskan sense, but there's a wildness to it. There is a self-driving, a space for self-generating nature, which I think is very inspiring. And you find that even in inner cities with sort of ethnic minority communities, for example, getting organized in order to protect city brown space, as they call it, and the biodiversity there. And although I sometimes get sort of critiqued by conservationist friends who think we ought to be throwing all our dollars into the rainforest by enthusing about this kind of stuff, they say, well, there's no biodiversity there. And I say, no, but this is the place where you turn the corner. This is the place where you turn around and actually people start to fight back and they create space for nature. And it's going to be a kind of hybrid, but it's there, and I do find that very exciting.
I'm just going to put in that about a year and a half ago, a paper was published called The Death of Environmentalism. And it was about how between the birth of the environmental movement in the United States in the 60s and into the 70s, and the birth of Earth Day and all the excitement around the photograph of the globe taken from space, between then and the 90s, in the United States, environmentalists seemed to lose their way, and the movement seemed to have died. That was a year and a half ago. In the year and a half since then, we had Tony Blair convening the G8 and announcing that, together with poverty alleviation in Africa, that global warming was the single greatest issue facing humankind and should be the focus of the G8. We had Al Gore, who everyone had thought was a joke, producing a documentary movie that ended up being one of the most widely watched movies, even competing with blockbusters. And then we had the Stern Report in the UK. I see massive change in the last year and a half, and I think that we might well be on the edge of a new global environmental movement. And I think the fact that Cambridge has just announced 2 new chairs in this subject, is taking the lead in environmentalism, is becoming probably the environmental center of the globe, is one part of that. The fact that we have a vice chancellor who is a conservationist, the fact that this meeting is going on.
I don't know if you want to end on a sad note. I mean, there is no wilderness anymore. We have shifted the baseline to the point where we can't shift it back. And do I think that's a horrible loss? I think it's inexcusable if you look at what we've done in this country in 250 years. Do I think we can create species that are a substitute? I think that's frightening. So yeah, I'm very pessimistic. We have lost much of the natural world, and we have inserted ourselves into it. Do I have hope? Sure, because if you don't have hope, what's the alternative?
And on that ambiguous and challenging note, thank you all for taking the time to come and join us today.